Hello, everyone. My name is Clark Barrett. I'm a professor at the UCLA Department of Anthropology, and I'm director of the UCLA Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture. Thank you for coming to my talk today, and I'd also like to thank Professor Grossman for inviting me to give this talk. My talk today is called Unwise Choices and the Landscape of Morality. Most of my research and the research I'm going to show you is research on moral judgment and the factors that contribute to moral judgment. None of the data that I'll show you actually asks people's judgments about wisdom per se, but what I want to ask is whether these data provide any insight into possible dimensions of similarity and variation in judgments about wisdom across cultures. So I'll be asking today how people think about the relationship between wisdom, mental states, and ethical life. I'll be asking if there are major differences in how cultures construe this relationship, and I'll be using a case study of mental states in moral judgment in 10 different cultures around the world. And I'll highlight in this rather large data set a couple of examples of what I might call unwise choices. These are choices that are reckless or that involve mistake of fact. And I'll show you how people make judgments about these in this sample of 10 different cultures. And I'll raise some open questions that I won't answer, but I think that the data point us to interesting phenomena that we might address in future research. And these include, is there a duty to know things and to act reasonably? Who has this duty and when? Is this a duty that falls differently upon wise people and people who are not as wise or ordinary people? Do these standards of reasonableness and duties to know vary across cultures? So I'll tell you a little bit about me and my background. I'm trained in both anthropology and in psychology and cognitive science. And so I use a combination of methods. The main kinds of methods that I use that I'll be showing you today are what are derived from experimental psychology and experimental philosophy. But I combine them with ethnographic work to try to understand the context of people's judgments in those experiments. And I've mainly worked in Shuar, Achuar, and Shuar communities in Ecuador since the late 90s. These are indigenous communities in the Amazon region of Ecuador. You can see there on the left, the red circle is the center of the region where I work. And this is a picture of some of my friends in the community of Chapinza in Pastaza province in Ecuador, giving you a sense of kind of what daily life is like. And often the interviews that I'm going to show you are conducted in this kind of context. They're done individually, of course, but in people's households in rural settings. And I also want to mention that I'm co-PI on the Geography of Philosophy project. This is an ongoing project that Professor Grossman is also affiliated with, in which we are trying to address many of the questions that I will raise today that I'm not answering, and we're in the process of data collection and analysis. So stay tuned and keep an eye out for papers coming out of this project, and please visit our website if you're interested. I have also been asked as part of my talk to address a few questions from a survey that was distributed to conference participants. And these, I sort of group them as all in some way about relationships between mental states and wisdom. So one of them had to do with the phenomenon of emotion and self-regulation, and whether there are, which are often considered to be central features of wisdom. Is there cultural variation in this? Another question has to do with the nature of knowledge, where some have claimed that declarative or factual knowledge is not a universal feature of wisdom. I'm actually sympathetic to this view, and I'll return to it at the end of the talk. A final question has to do with experiential knowledge and sympathy or compassion, and whether these are central to wisdom across cultures. Something that I also think probably is a very common aspect of wisdom across cultures. So let's keep those in mind as I go through my talk, and then I'll return to them at the end. The main research that I want to talk about today is a study that's about 5 years old now. This was published in 2016 in PNAS and was part of an earlier project called the Culture in the Mind Project that was headed by Professor Steve Lawrence at the University of Sheffield in the Department of Philosophy. You can also see here all of these other researchers were collaborators in the research, and we collected data at 10 different places around the world. And the aim of this study was to look at similarities and variation in the role of mental states, so intentions and other kinds of mental states in moral judgment. So in other words, how people's thinking about what the mental states of an actor are influence their moral judgments about that actor's choices and behavior. And we did this in 10 different places. Here's a map showing all these sites, including we did interviews with Shuar people in Ecuador and multiple other places around the world, including city dwellers in LA. And there's a very rich data set. If you're interested, please go check out the paper, because I'm only going to talk about a small slice of the data here. This is a kind of high-level snapshot of one of the findings of the study. So here you see the different society samples along the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have what we called mean severity of moral judgment. And here we asked actually 3 different DVs. One was how bad the act was. Another was whether the individual should be rewarded or punished and how much. And a third what had to do with the reputational effects of the act. So will people think well or poorly of the individual based on what they did? And turns out that those were very highly correlated. And so we put them together as a composite of sort of moral rightness or wrongness. And what you see, and this will be true in most of the graphs I'm showing you, that the judgments, the vertical dimension in the y-axis indicates worse moral judgments, or that the act was judged as more bad, the higher up the scale that you go. And so here I've pooled many different scenarios that differ in, and I'll show you some examples of these, in whether the action done was on purpose or by accident. So that's high intent versus low intent. And this pools across a bunch of different scenarios. But one of the things you can get a sense of here is that there's variation across the sites in sort of just the strength of the moral judgments, where on the left you see Hadza and Himba communities in Tanzania and Namibia, respectively, generally had pretty strong moral judgments about these situations, judging them badly. These are mostly harms of various kinds compared to people in LA and Ukraine on the right. And then there's another effect that you can see, which is the difference between the light and the dark blue bars, which indicates the average difference between a harmful act done on purpose versus one done by accident. You see again on the left with the Hadza and Himba participants, they generally made a lesser distinction between those than in LA and Storoznica, a village in Ukraine, meaning that in some way the accidents were less exculpatory for, on average, for the communities on the left-hand side of the graph than for Angelenos and Ukrainians, for example. And so we can dive into this and break it down a little bit. This shows the same data, but just broken down by scenario. So we had 4 different contexts or domains. There was a case of theft where somebody purposely steals someone else's stuff versus takes it by mistake. We had a well poisoning scenario that I'll tell you about, where the harm was fairly extreme. Someone poisons an entire village well, either on purpose or by accident. A physical harm or battery condition where someone strikes another person on purpose by accident. And a food taboo situation where someone ingests food that is prohibited or prescribed in their culture, and they do so either knowingly or not knowing what the food is. And so you can see there's a fair amount of variation here too. And I'm just going to pick a couple of these scenarios that I think involve what we might call unwise choices. Let me just set the stage for thinking about potential relationships to wisdom. We can see from these initial data, there appear to be contextual and cultural variation in how much accidents are mitigating of blame compared to accidentally committing the same harm. And I would note that the law in many countries, including the US, applies standards such as reasonableness to determine whether an accident is blameworthy or not. And reasonableness could relate to wisdom. Looking at how accidents are judged could tell us something about wisdom and how standards might or might not vary across cultures, right? So Typically, the reasonableness standard has to do with kind of the average person. Is it reasonable for an average person to have done this act? Or in cases of, for example, negligence, is it reasonable for an average person to not have known that a harm might result from their actions? And there's an interesting question that I don't know the answer to, but I think would be a great one to look at in future work, is whether these standards might differ across people who are regarded as either wise or unwise. Maybe contrasting sort of an average person with someone who's regarded as exceptionally wise. If standards of reasonableness are essentially higher for wise people, then you might think that they would be blamed more for the same action than for an average person doing it, if it's an accident that results in harm. And then a question that I'll also return to at the end, I don't know the answer to this, but I think it's an important one for us to ask, is, are the differences that we see, including the ones that I just showed you, should we think of those as sort of conceptual differences? And by that, what I mean is, are there really differences in the moral system in these different places, in the concepts underlying morality? Or are the differences more pragmatic? For example, in terms of what it's reasonable for a person to know, assume, or attempt in a particular place. So to preview one possibility, for example, it may be that poisoning a well in some places, engaging in some kind of negligent act or reckless act that results in poisoning a well, just could be viewed differently in a place where water is a scarce resource than in a place where it's not. And to me, that wouldn't necessarily mean that our notions of reasonableness or wisdom or moral responsibility or right or wrong differ in those places. What differs is just the sort of local knowledge about what is a reasonable or acceptable thing to do. And I think this is an important question, because often in psychology, we take these differences to be kind of fundamental differences in moral judgment. And I'm not sure that we know that that's the case. Further research is necessary for that. So let me give you just a couple examples to give you a sense of these data. Let me contrast an intentional harm scenario versus a recklessness scenario in the case of the well poisoning. So I'll just give you the language that we used when we ran this in Shuar communities, but this was modified depending on, the basic scenario is the same, but some details were modified for different communities around the world. So in this case, you have two Shuar men, Juan and Carlos, who live in a village where most people get their water from a well. Juan got his water from another source, but there was a swampy area near his house that fed into the community well. One day, Juan poured poisonous insecticide into the water that fed into the well, even though Juan knew there were instructions on the insecticide bottle that said, warning, poison, do not use drinking water. People got very sick, someone almost died. Okay, so this seems like a knowing, he's pouring poison into the well and he knows that it's poison. Contrast that with the case where he believed the insecticide was not harmful to people and he'd been assured by a trusted merchant that it was not. He performs the same action, the outcome is the same, but there's a difference here in what Juan believes or knows. My apologies here that the data are, the axes are flipped from what I showed you earlier, but this is similar kind of data. Now on the y-axis, we have the societies in question, and then on the right, on the x-axis, we have strength of moral judgment with increasing badness judgments towards the right-hand side. And this is just for the poisoning scenario. So what you can see is that the blue means and the confidence intervals show that people generally viewed the intentional version of this to be pretty bad across societies. This is a 5-point scale where 0 is the midline. So 2 would be the most extreme bad judgment you could make. Everyone is between 1 and 2 on this. But then you can also see that there are differences in how much the mistake of the belief that it wasn't harmful mitigates the wrongness. And I'll just highlight these with some boxes so you can see some of this variation. Again, Hadza and Himba communities, these are Hadza communities in Tanzania and Himba communities in Namibia, had extreme judgments and also very little difference between the intentional and accidental versions. The Angelinos, which is the second box down, the accident mitigated it by about half. And in a village in Ukraine, Storoznica, you actually see that where if you look at the red dot, that's very close to 0, meaning that there's almost no blame for the accident in this case. So that's pretty large difference. And we don't yet know, as I said, exactly why those differences are there. Let me give you one other example, and then I'll turn to a discussion of this. So we also had a battery where a battery of questions, but they also all involve the active battery of striking another person. And we varied what the reasons were for the agent doing this. So these were all cases where, in a sense, that the battery is done on purpose, but there's various kinds of mitigating factors. So, for example, you can see self-defense and necessity were two cases where in all the cultures, these had some degree of mitigation. They either made the act neutral or close to neutral, or in some places like LA and Storesnitsa, they actually turned an active battery from something blameworthy to something praiseworthy, which perhaps illustrates cultural values of those places. And we had other kinds of mitigating circumstances, including mistake of fact, and I'll show you that scenario next. So here you can contrast just the simple intentional battery. There's two men, they don't know each other. They're a market. One guy turns and punches the other guy in the face. So we don't really get the context of this, but it's a clearly intentional case of battery. And then we have a case where there's a mitigating circumstance where the one man, Luis, sees two other men in a fight and thinks that he's breaking up the fight. And so he goes and punches Ernesto. And the other guy in the fight says, "Why did you do that? We were just pretending to fight. We weren't actually fighting." And so in both cases, Ernesto receives essentially the same harm. They're both done intentionally, but it's a mistake of fact in this case. So how do people vary in their judgments of this? Here we're back to the vertical axis, like the first graphs that I showed you. So the red bars show the judgments from mistake or fact. So you can see several patterns here. There's variation in how severely people judge just the intentional battery. So in Susurunga communities in New Ireland and Mardu communities in Australia, they were the most severe in judging the intentional battery. But the mistake of fact mitigated by about a half. And then in places like LA and Storesnitsa, the mistake of fact is almost entirely mitigating. In Hadza and Chimane communities, it's hardly mitigating at all. So I'm presenting interesting data here, and I find these data very interesting, but I also don't know the reasons for these. And in geography of philosophy, we're engaged in following up several different possibilities, including looking at judgments about reasonableness. So there's variation across cultures and contexts and when mistakes are forgivable. Does this relate to wisdom? We don't know. Are standards of reasonableness different for the average person versus the wise person? Do these standards imply that some kind of a duty to know is part of wisdom? Are there differences in expectations across cultures due to conceptual differences in what counts as moral ethical? Or are they more about pragmatic differences regarding what people can and should know? And that's something that I think hasn't been discussed very much. As I said, I want to raise that as a possibility because my hunch, especially based on ethnographic work in Shuar communities, is that I don't see huge conceptual differences in in concepts related to morality and even things like wisdom. But the details, of course, matter quite a bit. What one would expect a wise person to know in the United States versus a wise person in a rural community in Ecuador might be quite different, even if the notions of wisdom are maybe not so different. How does this relate to questions about emotion regulation, what counts as knowledge, and this question of sort of propositional knowledge, knowing that, versus more embodied or procedural knowledge, like knowing how? Let me, on that question, turn just to the three questions I was asked to address before I wrap up. So emotion and self-regulation to be central features of wisdom. Again, these data don't tell us for sure, but we did not manipulate emotion and self-regulation as part of this study. Nevertheless, some of the cases that I showed you, especially like the mistake of fact, some of the variation in how people judge that could be because of what's expected for a reasonable person when they come across a fight, for example. It's the fact that the character Luis in the story rushes in and punches a guy very quickly when he thinks there's a fight going on could be regarded as an unwise move, that he doesn't take the time to figure out what's going on. Hard to say how that might vary across cultures. I'm very interested in this question about declarative and factual knowledge. Like I said, I'm sympathetic to the idea that it might be a non-universal feature of wisdom. One reason is because if you look at the literature on indigenous epistemology, there's not a uniformity in how Indigenous people regard knowledge, of course. But one of the things that's common in this ethnographic literature on how people construe knowledge in Indigenous communities is that embodied and procedural knowledge are emphasized as being more important kinds of knowledge than knowledge that, so propositional or declarative or factual knowledge. And I think that there, my sense as well, working in Shuar communities, there is where, a lot of the skills are skills involved with social skills, about navigating the social world of other people. There are things like hunting, building houses, various kinds of practical skills like that are really highly valued. And while people do appreciate sort of academic learning, I think that it's not viewed as the highest form of knowledge that one can attain. So I don't think that's cross-culturally universal, but I certainly don't. I'm sympathetic to the idea that the idea that sort of book learning or academic learning is the most important form of knowledge is probably just true of some societies and probably not the majority of societies. Final question is whether experiential knowledge and sympathy and compassion are central to wisdom across cultures. And again, I have no data on this, but I do think that resonates with my view of what people describe as wise, and the people that I know in, for example, Shuar communities and in American communities, the people who are viewed as wise typically are sympathetic and compassionate, and have lots of experiential knowledge. And even here, I think that in the United States, at some level, people think experiential knowledge and procedural knowledge and know-how in some ways is a deeper form of knowledge than simply being able to rattle off a series of facts about the world. It's putting that knowledge to use that really, I would have a strong hunch that would be regarded as the pinnacle of wisdom. So we do see in some of the scenarios I presented cases where where declarative and factual knowledge matters. So in the case of the insecticide poisoning, it really is the guy either does or doesn't know whether the thing is poison. On the other hand, there's other kinds of procedural knowledge underlying that. The sort of riskiness of putting something into the water without being absolutely sure. I would posit that many people would say, they would simply recognize, well, the guy didn't know for sure that it was poisonous, but the whole point is that he should have known for sure, and that's why he's blameworthy. So the declarative and factual knowledge part might be secondary to other kinds of knowledge and skills. But these are important questions for future research, and hopefully this. I think there's much more to know in this area, and my colleagues and I in geography and philosophy, including Professor Grossman, are working on exploring these, and I hope that you all will as well, and that we'll learn more about this in the coming years. Thank you very much.